Hello, everyone, and welcome to this season of Right Reason and this particular episode of Right Reason with our host, Dr. Charlie Rice. How are you, Doctor?
Hi, glad to be here.
Dr. Rice spent years at Notre Dame and is still there, studying and not only studying but specifically teaching, medieval theology, medieval philosophy, Thomas Aquinas, the Summa, which is what this incredible thing is, and what this whole show is about. Actually, this whole season, we're looking at the various. Some of the various, shall we say, poorly reasoned arguments that have led to cultural and moral chaos, and how really St. Thomas Aquinas addresses some of these things 800 years ago.
He helps us out.
He really does. He really does. But we were just chuckling before the show, actually, about the idea of a super God. You know, the God before God who gives God all of his attributes, and so. But that's obviously not true. But when we talk about the attributes of God, you say, if there's a God, what do you know about him? You don't know. How do you know if it's not the God of the Aztecs or this or First, when we talk, before we get right to the attributes, let's talk specifically about what we mean by God. What is God, and how come there can't be two gods?
What we mean by God is the eternal being who is self-existent. Mm-hmm. His essence is to exist, and the virtue of using Thomas is that he shows us that we can know God not just by faith but also by reason.
Right. And
we can't know everything about God because we're not God. But we've talked before about the fact that we can know that there always had to be that necessary eternal being. Right, and so then the
and that's why there can't be two.
There can't be two, because if there were two, you'd say, well, wait a minute,
what's the difference?
Yeah, but exactly. Yeah. And also, who divided reality among them?
Yeah.
All right.
If you had two infinite, eternal things.
And the attributes of God. As Thomas gets into these one by one, which we can just talk about a couple of them here.
Sure.
God is infinite, that there are no limits. That one necessary being, if you haven't reached that one infinite being, you haven't found God yet. I mean, the one necessary being has to be has to be infinite. That is, that what he says is that means there are no limits.
Right.
If there were, who set them? Right. And
again, that's an idea from the idea of finiteness versus infiniteness.
Right. Infinite, yeah.
The finite is where you get the word definition from.
Yeah.
It sets boundaries.
Yeah.
So
and
God isn't bounded.
One of the practical effects of that is that if God is infinite, then other things follow. He knows everything. He can do everything. We'll talk about those in a minute. But how do you know that? What else does it mean? Well, Chuck Colson, I don't know if you recall, he was a great guy. He was in the Watergate thing, and rather than lie, he told the truth, and he went to jail for
kind of the original political whistleblower.
Right, and he was a great human being, and he I remember he said or wrote one time he was trying to figure out before he made his decision to tell the whole truth and that kind of thing. Can God really take care of me? Does he really take care of me? And what got him was his conviction that God had to be infinite.
Yeah. That
God has no limits. That he knows each of us by name.
Yeah.
All right?
And because he has to.
Yeah, well, there are no limits to God.
Right.
All right? And so that everything that happens, is from the ordaining or permitting will of God.
Right. Which means, what's the difference?
Well, the ordaining will of God, God decrees that this will be done. Permitting will of God, he permits this to happen to bring a greater good out of it.
Okay. So ordaining will of God, let there be light.
Yeah.
Permitting will of God.
Well,
we have an earthquake occurs.
You permit a crime. Not because you're endorsing what the person is doing, but you're going to bring a greater good out of it.
Right.
St. Maximilian Kolbe said this: God permits everything in view of a greater blessing.
Right.
And Father Chizek, who was a great Jesuit.
Yes, and behind Russia.
Yes,
in
he
the
spent 23
Soviet
years
Gulag
in the
system.
Soviet
Yeah.
Gulag system. And we had the privilege to meet him in New York
Father Chisholm.
after he came back, and he blessed our first 4 kids.
Oh, that's tremendous.
But he wrote 2 books on it.
Yeah.
2 books. One was With God in Russia.
In
The
Russia.
other was He Leadeth Me.
Yeah.
And his point was that well, let me tell you a quick story. He was in prison in Lubyanka in Moscow, and they interrogated him, and they wanted him to confess to being a Vatican spy.
Right.
And they told him, they said, I'm going to write up my notes and write up the interrogator said, I'm going to write up the documents. Next time you come down here, I'm going to give them to you, and you sign or you die. And he went back. He was a tough guy. He went back to his cell.
From Iowa, wasn't he?
No,
originally?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, okay.
You know, and he was a tough guy. He used to throw himself into the ice cold water to prove how tough he was.
Yeah.
And he just steeled himself. All right. And he went in there, and they shoved the documents at him, and he caved.
Yeah.
He signed every one without reading them.
Yeah.
And he went back to his cell. He was ashamed. And then he had a conversion. He said, the reason I failed was because I trusted in Walter Chisholm rather than Christ. And he wrote about it. And he said, in terms of trusting in the infinite, power and mercy of God, which is what Thomas explains. He said, God's will was not hidden out there somewhere. The situations were his will for me. Mm-hmm. Nothing happens unless he ordains it or permits it.
Right.
He said, what you have to do is, as he said, let go of the reins. Let him, turn it over to him. All right? And what he demands is an act of absolute trust, demanding absolute faith in his existence, his providence. Note this, his concern for the minutest detail. Mm-hmm. His power to sustain me and his love protecting me.
So in the Sacred Heart morning offering prayer, many Catholics say it, series of lines. One of them says, Sacred Heart of Jesus, I believe in your love for me.
Yeah. Yeah, by name.
It kind of seems self-evident that. It's like, well, of course Jesus loves me. But to make a prayer out of that, to sort of reinforce the idea that exactly what you're saying, yes.
Yeah.
You have to believe that God cares about you.
Each and every one.
Every hair on your head.
And the reason for that is, as Chuck Colson affirmed, is that God is infinite.
Right.
And God, let's talk about 2 things. Let's talk about his power, and let's talk about his knowledge.
Okay.
Right? I mean, God is omnipotent. Okay, smart guy. Can he make a square circle?
No, but he can lift a rock so big he can't pick it up or make it or whatever.
That's the next question. Can he make a rock so heavy he can't build it? Can't lift it? No, those are no thing. Those are nothing. They're contradictions. Contradictions in terms.
Right.
God is not limited. He's all powerful. Because if it was anything, any element of reality he couldn't do, you'd have to say, well, why not? And who took it away from him?
Right.
All right? So he is all-powerful, and he is all-knowing. Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about a really troublesome question for a lot of people. Does God know everything? Yes. All right? Past, present, and future. Why? Because there's no time in eternity, and God is infinite. Mm-hmm. All right? And so you say, okay, does God know I'm going to rob that bank next Wednesday? And if he knows I'm going to rob, if next Wednesday I rob the bank, the week before, did God know I was going to rob that bank? The answer is yes, he did. Well, how could I have been free to do it?
Yeah.
All right? And this is one of the 3 great mysteries of the Christian religion. One is the Trinity. The second is the Incarnation. And the third is the coexistence of our free will and the infinite knowledge of God.
Yeah, see, that's one of the things I've never quite understood how people have a problem with that. For example, you know, I'm outside of this book.
Right, right.
So I can pick up the book and I can read the whole thing and I can get to the end and say, yeah, okay, the butler did it.
Right.
I put the book down. Okay, now it comes time for me to look at the book.
Right.
So for whatever reason, I'm scheduled to read it now. The fact that I already know that the butler did it doesn't, my knowledge of that outside of the book doesn't impose itself on the book and make the butler do it.
You know.
I've never understood why people have a problem with that.
The first thing to do is to look at the question of free will. I mean, St. Thomas emphasizes that God knows everything. God is without limit. He knows everything.
Sure.
Well, do we really have free will? Our will is not free in everything.
Right.
You're not totally free to decide whether to pay your taxes or your water bill. Right?
Well, you are. You can not pay or go to jail.
I know, but you're being compelled. But how do you know you have free will?
Yeah.
Well, Bishop Sheen, who was the patron of Church Militant TV,
Yes, he is.
put it simply, he said, if you don't have free will, the words please and thank you would be meaningless. And again, you're not free in everything. Mm-hmm. But how do you know you're free? You know you're free because it's in your head. I mean, look at it in terms of an action you're doing. Suppose you're trying to decide whether to go to law school. Mm-hmm. All right? You know when you're deciding that you can go or not go. You can choose either one. Mm-hmm. You decide to go. And you say, here I am. It's my fault. I chose it, all right?
I'm $250,000 in debt.
Yeah. You know you chose to do it.
Right.
And you say, well, man, I should have joined the circus, all right?
Right.
All right? But you know you chose to do it, and it was your decision. And then afterwards, have you ever felt regret? Oh, why did I do that? All right? Well, you did. And you regret it. You say, why didn't I do this? Well, we know there's free will. Mm-hmm. The real question is, does God know what we're going to do? The answer is yes. Why? Because God knows everything. Mm-hmm. And we know that he's infinite. We know that he's infinite because he's the one necessary being who is, as Thomas says, is necessary for everything else to exist. And he has to be infinite, he has to be without limit, and he has to be all good, and he has to have all the virtues and all the rest of that. And his knowledge is unlimited. And you say, well, how can that coexist? Well, you know that both things exist. And as I said, it's one of the great mysteries of the faith. Mm-hmm. That you know that this is true. You know that God knows everything. And I go back to St. Maximilian Kolbe. God permits evil to bring a greater blessing out of it. Mm-hmm. But everything that happens is through the ordaining or permitting will of God. Right. And the advantage of looking at St. Thomas on all this stuff is that you get the realization, hey, I can know that. Not just by faith. Faith is a greater way of knowing.
Right.
But I can know that through my reason. I know I have free will. I know that God has to be infinite. How could those two things happen? I don't know. It beats me.
Let me throw you a curveball here in our last minute of the show. Ordaining and permitting will of God. Okay, ordaining we get. God directly does something, and that's it. The permitting will of God. If God allows something that is bad so that a better thing will come from it.
Can come from
it. Then why, then can we say that we shouldn't fight evil? People say, well, you know what? God's allowing that to happen. Let it happen. Does that absolve us of our duty to fight whatever the thing is?
No, because it doesn't withdraw from us our free will and our responsibility, our duty to choose the good. All right, mm-hmm. And God, we are free. All these people that say that the Catholic religion and Christianity is an oppressive thing. No, it's a religion of freedom.
Yeah.
And Thomas emphasizes this, that the human person is free to make these choices. Well, God permits him to make a bad choice. The people that persecuted the people of Israel, all right? And God permitted them to do that. The brothers who sold Joseph, why did God permit that evil? He permitted that evil to bring a greater good out of it.
Right.
He didn't cause them to do it.
Right.
They chose of their free will to do it. But he brought a greater evil out of it.
Good.
A greater good out of it. Thank you. He brought a greater good out of it. And see, that's the great mystery. We don't know everything about God, but some things we do know, and that's the advantage of St. Thomas.
Yeah.
And we trust God. You trust him. Why? Because he's trustworthy.
Because he's trustworthy. Because that's what you get when you have an infinite being.
Yes, exactly
An
right.
eternal, infinite being. Dr. Rice, thank you
Mike.
very much.
Right.
If this isn't enough to have the audience noodle over their morning cup of joe. This is Michael Voris for Right Reason with Dr. Charlie Rice. We will be back next time talking about the internal life of God. What do you mean by the Trinity and relationship and all kinds of interesting things like that?
Yeah,
right?
okay.
I love you all. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.